Oyez, oyez, oyez. All persons having business before the Honorable, the Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg of the United States are admonished to give their attention, for the Justice Ginsburg is now sitting. God save the United States and this honorable court.
Good evening. Tonight we'll hear argument in case number, well, I've lost count. The Women versus HERstory. Tonight we shall hear oral arguments, testimonies, from women throughout history, on behalf of themselves and future generations who will benefit from hearing such stories, take inspiration from them, springboard off of them, and pass them on. To record their oral accounts, cementing their places in the HERstory books, I call upon investigative journalist, world traveler, and war correspondent, Nelly Bly.
Nelly Bly, much obliged. When I was 20 years old, back when I was humble Elizabeth Jane Cochrane, a man wrote to an advice column in the Pittsburgh Dispatch. Distraught, he asked what he should do with his 5 unmarried daughters. The youngest was 18, the oldest, gasp, 26. He signed his query, Anxious Father. The columnist's response was that women were only meant to be homemakers, and then made a joke about the disposal of excess females. So, I submitted an anonymous, scathing rebuttal. The following day, Pittsburgh Dispatch's managing editor printed a notice in the paper asking for the anonymous scribe to reveal herself. I showed up at the paper's headquarters the next morning, a nervous Nelly. I needn't have been. They offered me a job. I titled my first column, The Girl Puzzle. What shall we do with our girls? The anxious father still wants to know. Girls, since the existence of Eve, have been a source of worriment to themselves as well as to their parents. As to what shall be done with them? If girls were boys, quickly would it be said, start them where they will. They can, if ambitious, win name and fortune. How many great and wealthy men can be pointed out who started in the depths? But where are the many women? Instead of gathering up the real smart young men, gather up the real smart girls. Pull them out of the mire and give them a shove up the ladder of life, and be amply repaid both by their success and their unforgetfulness to those who held out the helping hand. Employ them in every industry, in every profession. We are dynamic, ambitious, and capable. Oh, and worthy of an equal wage. So, where are the women? They are here. When I started writing for the Dispatch, I was assigned to write a column on the women's sphere, which meant hairstyles, homemaking, hosting, gossip. But I wanted to interview women, all kinds of women, to tell their stories and show the world their complexities, struggles, and triumphs. That is my role this evening. So, who is our first witness, Justice Ginsburg? Are they witnesses?
Well, a woman is witness to her own life, is she not?
The only one. All right, who is our first witness?
Please welcome to the stand, astronaut Kalpana Chawla.
Miss Chawla, You're an aeronaut?
An astronaut, Miss Bly. Not balloons, rockets, space, the moon.
We've gone to space? My things have escalated. So, Miss Chawla, what inspired you to become an astronaut?
Summers in Karnal, India, where I grew up, were often so warm, we slept in the courtyard underneath the stars. I'd gaze up at the Milky Way, watching for those shooting stars, asking myself all those very basic, very mysterious questions. I envisioned a life among those stars. I developed a sense of awe for the heavens on those summer nights. But becoming an astronaut was something I couldn't even fathom. As a girl in India in the 70s, you were discouraged from going to school. But not in the Chawla family, Miss Bly. My father came to India from Pakistan after the partition riots. The trek was brutal and very dangerous. Few who made the journey survived. But it was his struggle that made him a believer in dreams, as was my mother. She instilled a fire in me to pursue any passion, no matter how silly it seemed. So a girl going to school didn't seem too silly to them. I was one of the only 3 girls in grade school, and later, when I went to university for aerospace engineering, I was the only girl.
Was it your desire to be an astronaut which led you to a career in aerospace engineering?
I just loved aircrafts. They absolutely fascinated me. Something so large and seemingly impossible, humans flying. I was obsessed. I even drew them in class among my note margins. But my dream of building airplanes could only go so far in India. So, after earning my bachelor's degree, I applied for graduate school at the University of Texas.
And how did you get from America to space?
After earning my PhD in 1988, I became a research scientist. It was around this time I saw a NASA advertisement for astronaut applications. And Miss Bly, they were open to anyone. Anyone could apply. Yes, I know, I'm a small, 5-foot-tall, quiet girl from Karnal, India. But I knew I could do it. So I applied. My first mission was in 1996 as a prime robotic arm operator and a mission specialist on the STS-87.
And what was it like to finally transcend Earth?
The spacecraft goes from 0 to 17,500 miles per hour in just 8 seconds. The pressure on your chest, unbelievable, like someone 3 times your weight is sitting on your chest. But then you exit the atmosphere. The main engine shut off, and suddenly there's no gravity. Your arms float up, the weight off your chest disappears, and you're free floating. At first, you're very disoriented. When I slept, I felt like a disembodied consciousness. You float as you dream. And then you look down on Earth, and you realize how small we are, how connected everything is. You get a sense of it as a very fragile thing. After that first mission, I developed a strong urge to protect it and started a nature preservation foundation. If everyone saw the world from space, they'd want to cherish this small, magnificent globe, a single house for humanity. I considered myself a citizen of the world, not of one tiny nation. It's all connected.
You flew in one last mission, February 1st, 2003, STS-107 on the Space Shuttle Columbia. Did this mission feel different?
Well, in hindsight, there definitely are more circumstances that seem more fated than coincidence. There were 7 of us on that mission. Rick Husband, William McCool, Laurel B. Clark, Michael P. Anderson, David Brown, and myself, Casey, as they used to call me. You had to have an astronomical amount of trust with the people sitting right next to you. We were all from different races, nationalities, faiths, and yet responsible for one another's lives. Faith took on a whole new meaning. my entire Indian family, apart from my brother, had flown down to Texas to watch that launch. It was almost as if they knew. Something in the stars had brought them to me back that one last time.
Do you remember anything?
Every morning, ground control pipes and music. On that final morning, I was woken up by an Indian song from my childhood. I set to ground control. I had woken up just in the nick of time and recognized that song. It says, "My friends are in front of me, behind me, and all around me." It most definitely felt this way. But as to what happened in those last final moments, everything happened so rapidly. Upon re-entry to Earth's atmosphere, the shuttle began to break apart. We now know it was caused by a small mishap on takeoff a whole month prior. A small piece of the foam insulation had broken off and hit one of the heat-resistant tiles. That's it. Something so simple. As the shuttle broke apart, the cabin depressurized. We were gone within seconds.
Your husband said he was comforted knowing you died doing something you loved.
I used to tell young people to make sure your goals are something that you want to do. That sounds very obvious, but I don't think it is for many. It's about the journey. If the journey doesn't teach you something, if you don't learn from it, if it doesn't challenge you, what's the point? My journey took me farther than my childhood dreams could ever. From small town Kurnool, India, to the United States of America, and finally, to the stars. I'm still there.
And now, from the cosmos to cyberspace, our next witness holds an incredible list of honors. She was awarded the Defense Distinguished Service Medal. She was the first woman awarded the National Medal of Technology. She received at least 40 complimentary degrees. A guided missile destroyer was named after her. She was awarded a posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2016. And in 2017, Yale renamed Calhoun College in her honor. And it all started with a computer. Please welcome the Queen of Software, Navy Rear Admiral, and computer scientist, Amazing Grace Murray Hopper.
Well, now you didn't mention my personal favorite. The Data Processing Management Association named me their first ever Man of the Year.
Let me try that again. Please welcome the Data Processing Management Association's Man of the Year, Grace Murray Hopper.
Thank you.
Good evening, Admiral Hopper. Before we get started, I have one preliminary question. What is a computer programmer? A computer is someone who calculates.
Oh, no, Miss Bly. A computer is a machine. It processes instructions so it can perform certain tasks. Think of a player piano. The music notations are the instructions, and the piano, the machine, executes those instructions and outputs music. Now, as the programmer, I'm the one who feeds those instructions through code into the computer.
Oh, I see. I think.
Explaining 100 years of computer technology to someone from the 19th century, and to those of us who feel like we're from the 19th century, might be your most impressive feat to date, Admiral Hopper.
I went through naval training when I was almost 40. This is nothing.
So what sort of tasks do these computers perform?
Oh, well, they do just about everything now but brush your teeth. They function as calculators, word processors, compute rocket trajectories for the military. They access bank accounts, they give you directions, they predict the weather, and now they act as conduits for unending ranting and whining, which I suppose in some ways is my own darn fault.
How is that your fault?
Oh, I taught the computer how to understand English.
Take us to the beginning. How did you come to teach computers human language?
Well, I was born in New York City in 1906, and my mother loved math. And she passed that passion on to me, so that's where it started. I had always been interested in machines. And I was lucky that my parents thought I should have an education as decent as my brothers, so I went to Vassar, and then I went to Yale for my doctorate. And because Vassar was an all-female institution back then, I was able to get a teaching job there. But when the U.S. entered World War II, I wanted to join the fight because I knew I could make a contribution to the war effort in a way others couldn't. But I was denied for being too old, 34. Well, and too small. But I didn't take no for an answer. I pestered. And finally, in 1943, at age 37, I was made lieutenant. And they sent me to Harvard to work on the Mark I computer. It was the first digital program-controlled computer.
That is quite a machine. How did you know how to work this computer?
Oh, well, I didn't. This was the first one. Had to learn on the fly. My team and I were some of the world's first programmers, although we weren't called programmers back then. The concept had yet to exist.
Is Harvard where you taught the computer English?
No. In 1949, I left Harvard because they offered me no tenure nor promotion. So I went to the Eckert-Mauchly Computer Corporation and I worked on the UNIVAC 1 computer there. And I can see by the look on your face, these words are utterly useless to you. But this is where I developed the compiler. See, the compiler is the ticket. It's the thing that translates. Without it, you have to punch in numbers. See, the compiler allows us to use words.
But as a mathematician, numbers must come easy to you. What inspired you to develop the compiler?
Well, 3 reasons. 1, because computer programmers cannot read their own writing. 2, because they can't add. And 3, I'm lazy. As programmers, we copy code. Now, think the music notes, Miss Bly. We copy code into the computer, but no one could copy the darn codes correctly. A delta symbol would come out like a 4, and a 13 would end up looking like a B, and then you had to add all the addresses when inputting them, and decimals would get mistranslated. And so I'm sitting there looking at this machine whose sole purpose it is to add and copy, and I think, now why the heck aren't I making the machine do it? And that's when I developed AO, the world's first compiler. So in 1952, I had a running compiler and no one could believe it. Well, they refused to believe it. Told me computers could only do arithmetic. So it wasn't until I took that work and used it to develop the Flowmatic BO that the compiler was taken seriously. And we finally could input words rather than those darn math symbols. So computers didn't have to just be for mathematicians. If you could write English or eventually French, German, Spanish, you could use a computer. And this led to the development of COBOL, a universal business language that then became the most widely used computer language in the world. Ms. Bly?
Oh, I'm listening. There is a lot of new information for me to process. Like a computer. See, I get it. So this compiler led to these massive machines in the home?
Oh, no. They're not that big anymore. In fact, you can hold them in the palm of your hand now. You can talk to someone on the other side of the world with them. And you can watch performances on them. You can get more information than you will ever know what to do with on them. And none of this would have been possible without my compiler.
Incredible. You also had quite the naval career.
Well, they couldn't get rid of me. They forced me into retirement due to my age. A common theme in my life. In 1966, I was a commander by then, and that was the saddest day of my life. But one of the happiest days of my life was when they called me back to active duty the very next year. I was 61, and then I was promoted to Commodore by the White House in 1983, and Rear Admiral in 1985. I was the oldest active duty officer in the U.S. And then on 31 August 1986, at age 79, I finally did retire.
And what did you do with your sudden free time?
Oh, I went and got a job.
Grace Murray Hopper, or Amazing Grace as she was often called, worked as a consultant for the Digital Equipment Corporation until the day she died on January 1st, 1992, at the age of 85. She was buried with full military honors in Arlington National Cemetery.
Like Grace Hopper and Kalpana Chawla, much of my success lay in my stubborn determination to get an education despite society's discouragement. Like these two women, my parents instilled in me a rare, for the time, notion that I had as much right to go to school as my male contemporaries. My mother was the smartest person I ever knew, but there was a bitterness in her, sprung from the resentment that the short-lived independence she had was spent working to pay for her brother's college tuition. And when she was married, she was pressured not to work, as it was looked down upon. So my success as a scholar was all the more important to her. She was so happy when I was accepted into Cornell, but she never saw my first day. She died of cancer the day before my high school graduation. After her death, we discovered that she had secretly scattered a savings of $8,000 among several bank accounts to pay for my education. It was the most trying time of my life, but I knew she wanted me to study hard and get good grades and succeed, so that's what I did. When my husband Marty and I decided to attend graduate school together, it came down to a process of elimination. Harvard School of Business wouldn't accept women, nor would many medical schools, but Harvard Law did. So that settled it. I would become a lawyer. I encountered many instances of sexism at school, but perhaps the most telling story concerns the dean of Harvard Law, Erwin Griswold. He had invited the new female students, all 9 of us, to converse with our professors and share a dinner. When it seemed the evening had finally run its course and we all stood to depart, Griswold said he had one last question for us. How could each of you women justify taking a man's spot at Harvard Law? Well, we stood there, stunned, until he started asking us one by one. I wanted to disappear. One woman said, deadpan, I thought this would be a good place to find a husband. Griswold then called on me, and I knocked the ashtray onto the floor. I said, I want to know more about what my husband does so I can be a sympathetic wife. Griswold was oblivious to the sarcasm, but the answer seemed to satisfy. This was the narrative. School was for men, and women were something strange and singular that had to prove their worth 10 times over. It was because of my own experience that I considered it a profound honor to write the majority opinion for U.S. v. Virginia.
In 1996, the United States brought a lawsuit against Virginia for refusing to admit women to its publicly funded Virginia Military Institute. VMI said admitting women would hinder their mission, as they couldn't possibly train women using the same adversative methods that they used to train men. In a 7-1 court decision, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the women of the U.S. With this, Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote her first opinion for the Supreme Court.
Inherent differences between men and women we have come to appreciate remain cause for celebration, but not for denigration of members of either sex or for artificial constraints on the individual's opportunity. Sex classifications may be used to compensate women or to promote equal employment opportunity, but not to create or perpetuate the legal, social, and economic inferiority of women. A prime part of the history of our Constitution is the story of the extension of constitutional rights to people once ignored or excluded. VMI's story continued as our comprehension of we the people expanded.
Our next speaker is no stranger to the witness box, a self-created sex symbol, actress, writer, and censorship challenger. It has been said that there would not have been a women's liberation movement with it has been said that there would not have been a women's liberation movement without Mae West.
Oh, back in the hot seat again.
Yes, but this time on your own terms.
Oh, it was always under my own terms. They just didn't know it.
Mae West was born in Brooklyn, New York, August 17th, 1893.
Oh, allegedly.
Allegedly. Her first stage appearance was when she was only 7 as a...
Oh, don't stop there. That'll only bore them. I was a vaudeville baby, and that's all you gotta know.
Where would you like to start? Oh, Tell us about your first arrest.
Yeah, let's cut to the good stuff. After so many years in vaudeville, the material had grown tired, so I decided to write it myself. I wanted to look at real people, gritty issues the Puritanism of the 1920s ignored. And I wanted a title that would turn heads. So I called my first play, Sex.
Oh my!
Oh, Miss Bly, I wrote that 100 years ago. The word can't be that scandalous still, can it? We did 300 performances before we were shut down and arrested. We were charged with corrupting the morals of youth. There was no profane language, no violence, but the prosecution said it was my personality. Look, walk, mannerisms, and gestures that made the lines suggestive. I think it was because I was trying to hold a mirror up to society. You see, no one wants to look at themselves or the reality around them. They'd rather arrest the one holding the mirror rather than face the reflection. I was given a 10-day sentence, which they offered to commute, but the publicity was better behind bars, so I stayed. Didn't hurt that the warden and his wife took me out every night, too. I was an overnight sensation. But by the time I put up my fourth show, I had a hard time finding backers. So I backed myself. I'd amassed quite a collection of diamonds from various suitors. So I pawned them all and I put up my own show. And that show, Diamond Lil, well, that was the real start of my career. A failing Paramount Pictures thought I might just be the ticket the box office needed. They hired me for 4 scenes in a film called Night After Night. It was a small role and the dialogue was lousy. So I rewrote it. I rewrote everything I was ever in, including this.
Your co-star, George Raft, said she stole everything but the scenery. Were they pleased with your scene stealing?
So pleased they offered me my own picture. They asked me to turn Diamond Lil into a film called She Done 'Em Wrong. We made it for $200,000 and it made $2.2 million. It was even nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars. It was such a success, the studio head said I single-handedly saved Paramount Pictures from going bankrupt. When the studio boss was negotiating my contract, he asked me how much I wanted. So I asked him, how much do you make? He said, $250,000 a year. So I said, well, I want 251. And I got it. In 1935, I was the highest paid woman in America. But you can't please everyone. Believe me, honey, I've tried. My reputation preceded me. Censored all my pictures. Cut all my lines. And William Randolph Hearst, he had it out for me. At the time, he was the richest person in America. I was second, but he had real power. He owned the papers. He contacted studios and told them not to advertise my pictures. In an interview, he said, "Isn't it about time Congress did something about the Mae West menace?" In 1934, the Hays Codes was established. It was a set of moral codes designed to rein me in. It was used across the industry, but it was a direct response to my writing, my appearance. Got to the point where they gutted all my films of any substance. If I asked for a cup of coffee, someone go looking for the double meaning. My personality, my wit, my self-confidence, my sexuality, all were left on the cutting room floor.
Why do you think they were so determined to silence you?
Well, my wit was my persona. By trying to censor my lines, they were trying to erase me. They couldn't handle a woman beating the boys at their own game. My quips flipped the script and took the power right out of sexism. I represented a free sort of woman, one who flew in the face of the prescribed social norms. I was a danger to the established norm.
And she kept defying those social norms until the very end. After quitting the movie industry, going back to Broadway, then Vegas for 27 years, West appeared in one last picture at the age of 84, in which she played a 28-year-old. She was unapologetically Mae West.
Here's a little song I wrote about censorship. You might not have heard it because they censored it. I've the tiniest confession, I distinctly loathe suppression. Since I only have one life, I want to live it. Well, I've clowned around a lot, well, I've found what hits the spot. If I've something good to give, I want to give it. Now the censors say I'm naughty and no dice. But I've heard it said, what's naughty can be nice. It's not what I say, it's the way that I say it. That's all, brother, that's all. It's not what I play, but the way that I play it. That's all, brother, that's all. Now maybe they'd picture me as little Snow White. With 7 dwarves to entertain, I should do all right. But if I ask to concentrate on 1 dwarf a night, that's all, brother, that's all. It's not what I tell, it's the way that I tell it. That's all, brother, that's all. It's not what I sell, but the way that I sell it. That's all, brother, that's all. They'd have me play that little girl, all dressed in red. I'd make a good Red Riding Hood, somebody said. But if they catch me with a wolf in my grandmother's bed, that's all, brother, that's all. That's all, brother, that's all. Why don't you come up and see me sometime?
Our next witness defeated all the odds to become one of the greatest tennis champions the world has ever seen. Please welcome Althea Gibson.
Welcome, Miss Gibson. You were the first African American to cross the color line in 2 sports, but we'll focus on tennis first. How did you find tennis?
Well, I was born on a cotton farm in South Carolina, August 25th, 1927. But I doubt I'd have found tennis there if we had stayed. I discovered tennis on the streets of Harlem, where I grew up. Our street was closed off by the Police Athletic League, and they set up a paddle tennis court right in front of my parents' stoop on West 143rd. Oh, I was good at sports. My daddy wanted a son, so he treated me as one. We'd go to the rooftops and box, no holding back. So I was never confined by gender stereotypes, but I was confined by access to the tennis courts. Tennis was a privileged sport, a rich sport, a white sport. The ones playing were the ones who had access to the tennis clubs. So I found my way around that by sneaking onto the courts at night. There was little light, so I couldn't even see the lines. I could only feel the lines. I think that's one reason I got so good. One of the paddle coach tennis volunteers brought me to the Cosmopolitan Tennis Club. It was a private club for the black bourgeoisie. Whew. That was a different world. I was unprepared for the genteel confines of tennis. I was a wild child. I liked to stay out all night, not come home till morning. I just wanted to play, play, play. I dropped out of school in the 8th grade. And here I am in this world of money, education, and high class. I started playing American Tennis Association championships. That's a tennis organization for black players. And they didn't know what to do with me. Hecklers would set me off and I'd take off into the stands and lay them out. I tell you. Well, one day I caught the eyes of Drs. Hubert Eden and Robert Johnson. And Dr. Johnson comes up to me and says, "How'd you like to play Forest Hills one day?" I said, "Don't kid me. Forest Hills, that's where the U.S. National Championship was held. Now the U.S. Open, that was whites only. But the doctors were determined to cross the tennis color line. So they took me and the sponsors. My whole world was tennis training, tennis tournaments, and etiquette training. Oh, they had to teach me how to lose graciously. It was something. Oh, there was a lot of discipline involved. They had to teach us and prepare us for a world that didn't want us. Those two men put a lot of work into my success on and off the court. I won 9 ATA tournaments my first summer with them. And they pushed me to finish high school. I finally graduated when I was 22.
On August 28, 1950, you finally got to Forest Hills, becoming the first African American to play in the National Tennis Championships. What happened?
I beat Barbara Knapp on the first day, and on the second I was faced with Louise Brough. She had just won Wimbledon and was defending champion. The crowd, the stands were full of hecklers, yelling at Brough to beat to defeat me. I lost the first set, 6-1, but I came back in the second set. I won the second set, 6-3. At the start of the third set, I slipped again. I was losing 3-0. A coach of mine said one of my greatest weaknesses was that I was self-defeatist. Too much in my own head. Gave up once I started to lose. But I came back that day. I tuned it all out, and just as the storm clouds were moving in, I moved in to take the lead. Whew! I came back with a vengeance. The crowd, over 2,000 people who had just been screaming for my demise, were suddenly yelling for my victory. I was up 7-6, and Brough was used up. It started pouring. I was still going. Rain never stopped me from playing paddleboard back home. Rain falling, thunder rolling, and then crack! Lightning shot down and struck the giant stone eagle perched on top of the stadium. Whew, it cracked and crashed down. One reporter said it was because God was mad. No, that was an omen that times were changing. Well, the eagle had fallen, but my time would have to wait. They'd suspended the match due to rain. We were to pick up again tomorrow. Well, it seems like I hadn't quite defeated my demons. The next day, after losing momentum and a night's sleep to anger and self-doubt, and then being faced with hordes of reporters and photographers, I let it get to me. I lost the match.
But there is a long list of wins that came after.
Well, they didn't happen overnight. A lot of setbacks and hard work. I almost quit. But in 1956, I won 16 of 18 tournaments I played. And then I was the first Black player to play Wimbledon, competing in a doubles tournament with Angela Buxton. I was Black, she was Jewish. No one wanted to pair with either one of us, so we found each other and won Wimbledon. And in 1957, I won Wimbledon on my own. I will never forget taking that trophy from the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth. Shaking hands with her was a long way from being forced to sit in the colored section of the bus going into downtown Wilmington, North Carolina. And yet the sweetest victory was the next one. Oh, Forest Hills, the U.S. Open, 7 years after my debut. Me against Brough once again. But this time, it was mine. I won, no sweat. And I did it again the next year, as well as Wimbledon.
You were the first Black player to be ranked #1 in the world. That must have felt unbelievable.
Yes, I finally made it to the top. But you can't eat a crown. There was no money in tennis. Now sports stars are billionaires. Then any money you earn just got you to the next tournament. I wasn't making enough to survive. I had to quit tennis.
After leaving tennis, Miss Gibson used her wealth of disparate talents to support herself. She wrote an autobiography, recorded a record. Her singing voice is as powerful as her arm. And then, in 1960, she found golf. By 1964, she was the first African-American member of the Ladies Professional Golf Association.
Yes, Michael Jordan, well before Michael Jordan. I never won any tournaments, though. My golf career didn't last long, and it didn't bring in any money. I then entered a rather dark time in my life. I became reclusive, depressed. The world forgot about me. Medical bills were out of control. I couldn't afford rent. One day I decided I didn't want to go on anymore because I'd lost all joy. I called my old doubles partner, Angela Buxton, my dear friend, and I said, Angie, baby, things aren't too good over here. I've got nothing left. I have no money. It's about time I ended things. I just wanted to call and say goodbye. Angie said, hang on, Althea, no. How much do you need? I said, I'm about $1,500 behind in rent and other bills. She said, it's in the mail, and I'll figure out how to get you out of this. Well, about 6 months later, I was on my way to the post office one day to get my mail. And they couldn't even open the darn box. It was so stuffed full of letters. They said there was more like that in the back. I said, what on earth? I opened one of the letters, and there was a card in there with someone saying how much I meant to them, how they loved watching me play, and I inspired them. And a $20 bill fell out. I called my friend Angie and I said, Angie, baby, did you do this? She said, do what? She finally came clean, though. She had written a letter to Tennis Week magazine, reminding readers who I was and my contribution to tennis, saying if I ever meant anything to them, I was in need of financial assistance. And it was time to pay up, baby. Oh, there ended up being over $1 million. The money helped, but sometimes feeling appreciated and the joy that comes with that is what one really needs to keep going.
Althea Gibson died September 28, 2003, at the age of 76. Angela Buxton wrote in her letter to Tennis Week, Althea Gibson titled her poignant autobiography, I Always Wanted to Be Somebody. She was and is a somebody very special.
Though their stories seem disparate, Miss Gibson and Miss West demonstrate the importance of women being paid their worth and the consequences when they are not. When I was offered a teaching contract at Rutgers in the fall of 1963 at the age of 30, my salary was considerably lower than my male counterparts. When I confronted the dean about this, he said, "I can't pay you as much because your husband earns a high salary." I kept my head down and my mouth shut. There was no further discussion. But in 1970, inspired by the influx of brilliant, radical women filling my classrooms, I decided to finally put my foot down for myself and the women working beside me. My fellow Rutgers professors and I filed a federal class action lawsuit against Rutgers for pay discrimination. We won. I cannot say the same for Lilly Ledbetter.
One evening, Lilly Ledbetter opened her mailbox to discover an anonymous letter. It held a torn piece of paper which listed all the manager's salaries at the Goodyear tire plant. She discovered she made $15,000 less than the men in her same position. She sued for pay discrimination, and in 2007, the lawsuit made its way to the Supreme Court. Ledbetter lost, 5-4. Samuel Alito gave the majority opinion, stating that although Ledbetter may have indeed been discriminated against, her case was beyond the statute of limitations, and she should have filed a charge within 180 days after each discriminatory employment decision was made and communicated to her.
I dissent. Pay disparity often occurs, as it did in Ledbetter's case, in small increments. Cause to suspect that discrimination is at work develops only over time. Today's decision counsels sue early on when it is uncertain that discrimination accounts for the pay disparity you are beginning to experience. Indeed, initially you may not know that men are receiving more for substantially similar work. Of course, you are likely to lose such a less than fully baked case. If you sue only when the pay disparity becomes large enough and steady enough to enable you to mount a winnable case, you will be cut off at the court's threshold for suing too late. I then called on Congress to take action where the court had failed.
It worked. On January 29, 2009, President Barack Obama signed into law the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009. It amends Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, specifically stating that the 180-day statute of limitations for pay disparity resets with each and every paycheck. What happened to Lilly Ledbetter couldn't happen again.
And now, America's first prima ballerina, Maria Tallchief.
Position 1, in which I am born of two worlds. January 24th, 1925, on the Osage Reservation in Fairfax, Oklahoma. My daddy is an Indian Tallchief, Kihe Ka Tatsa. My mother, Scots-Irish, Porter. When I am little, Daddy and Grandma Tallchief take me and my sister Marjorie to a powwow. I remember the clothing, hides, headdresses, beads, blankets, silver jewelry, moccasins. We sit in a semicircle amongst pipe smoke, but mostly I remember the dancing. The men dance to a tom-tom beat, a sidestep and stomp centered in a circle. There is rhythm in everything. The drums, the songs, the fables, the dancing. The rhythm of those songs stay with me forever. Second position, in which I find my second soul. When I am 3, Mom takes me to my first ballet lesson. She doesn't know whether I'll be a concert pianist or a dancer. I am good at both. In 1933, Mother throws everything behind me and my sister's talents. We pack up Daddy's maroon Pierce Arrow and we set off for Los Angeles. My new instructor says I was put on point too early. I have to start over, back to the beginning. A new town, new state, new instructor, new dance, new school, new classmates. They shout war whoops at me in the halls, ask me where my feathers are, call me a redskin. They don't understand my name. Tallchief is 2 words. They call me Maria Chief or Maria Tall. They can't understand that someone can be 2 things at once. I turned Tallchief to 1 word. When I turned 12, I started taking lessons from Madame Nijinsky. She is strict and rigorous, and she makes me want to be a ballerina. She teaches me how to breathe, how to really breathe. My breath is for ballet. She teaches me that my dancer's soul is in the center of my body, and my body and soul are for ballet. Third position, in which I begin. I am 17 and alone for the first time in my life. Alone in New York City. I am scared and excited and sad and nervous and overjoyed, and a member of the Ballet Russe. They say you should change your name to Tallchief to sound more European, but I refuse to change who I am. We travel by train and sleep sitting up. We squeeze 4 of us into a hotel room. We sleep on sofas, on tables, on floors. I lose 15 pounds living off 25-cent plates of spaghetti. New town, new stage, warm up, makeup, dance. New town, new stage, warm up, makeup, dance. My body aches and I am always sick and cold and tired, but I love every moment. We performed the Chopin Concerto, choreographed by Madame Nijinsky. It holds a special place in my heart. I played it on the piano at home. One day the lead, Natalie Krasovska, storms out. The head of the Ballet Russe says I must go on opening night in New York City. The others say I am not ready, that I'll make a fool of myself. But I have been practicing every day. I have been waiting for this moment. The dance is hard, but my concentration's stern. And I know that music. I played it with my fingers on the keyboards, and now I must dance it on the floorboards. And I am a triumph. The New York Times says Miss Tallchief is the real discovery. And when she grows up, so to speak, she can hardly escape being somebody. Fourth position, in which I transform. In 1944, my life changes forever. I meet George Balanchine, the greatest choreographer who ever lived. You know, Maria dear, if only you would learn to do battement tendu properly, you wouldn't have to learn anything else. Start over, back to basics, again. Slide front and close, derriere, close fifth, side cross behind, side cross in front, switch to the back. My technique gets stronger. The attention to details pushes my performance beyond my imagination. Battement frappe, fifth position, strike, close, strike, flex, stretching in. I go through a metamorphosis. My body does astonishing things, and I realize mastery is a journey, not a destination. I become George's prima ballerina, on stage and at home. We get married. It's as if I marry ballet itself. George starts Ballet Society, with me as his muse and he as mine. The Four Temperaments, Orpheus, Swan Lake, Don Quixote, practice, drill, repetition, practice, pas de cheval, in and out and close, in and out and close. For 5 years, George and I spent 14 hours a day rehearsing and performing, and then Stravinsky's Firebird, the hardest performance of my career. I get sick, I look frail, I can't eat, I can barely swallow. Days before opening night, I go to the hospital. It is tonsillitis. They perform surgery, and I lie in bed for 2 days, unable to sleep because I fear the Firebird. Its premiere is on November 27th, 1949, and so is its final dress rehearsal. I arrive at dawn, days after my tonsillectomy. I am sore, weak, and tired. We haven't even performed it with an orchestra yet, nor seen the costumes. My feathered headpiece, top heavy and awkward, arrives 10 minutes before curtain, but there is nothing left to do. Something is always going to go wrong. It's never going to be perfect. You just have to learn to move on. Standing in the wings as the orchestra begins, I stop thinking. Just dance. There is a moment in Firebird where I leap across the stage into the prince's arms. The movement is magic. One moment I'm on one side of the stage, the next I'm in my partner's arms on the other side. The audience gasps. I have flown and they can't see how. The curtain falls. There is a hush and we stand in the dark in shock. It's over and we haven't even staged the curtain call. The curtain rises and I'll never forget the sound. The audience roars louder than a football game. The curtain falls and rises 9 times and they keep shouting my name. Tallchief, Tallchief, Tallchief. 5th position, in which I don't have to choose. At 26, I realize I want a child. George has no desire for a child. His child is ballet. You are worth more to me as a ballerina than a mother, Maria. Ballerinas rarely have babies. The physical demands, the touring, the commitment. You have to choose, baby or ballet. But I want both. George and I part. But I am still his prima ballerina on stage, and he creates for me one of the greatest roles. The sugar plum fairy in the Nutcracker. And then I meet Buzz. In 1958, we have a baby girl. The day I returned from the hospital, I put on my toe shoes. I wear them around the house. I exercise on the bar as the baby naps. One day, I fall asleep on the sofa with my toe shoes on. My father sees me sleeping in the nursery with my toe shoes and he says, "Maria, you ought to be content. You have a husband, a child. Perhaps it's time to put those toe shoes up for good." I could never. I must dance. I am only just beginning. I tour Europe. I am the first American to perform at Bolshoi Theater in Moscow. I performed for Premier Khrushchev. But touring leaves me homesick. I want to dance while standing still. In 1974, I decide to teach. I open a school. Like Madame Nadzinska, I spend the rest of my life helping young dancers find their second soul. Batmantandu, in which I am born of 2 worlds. In 1953, I was inducted into the Osage tribe by the Tribal Council. They gave me the title Princess Watetomba, Princess Woman of 2 Standards, because I arabesque along the Oklahoma plains.
Our next witness has devoted her life to the most essential among us, the farm workers who sustain the nation. She is one of the greatest organizers the world has ever seen, and she is as tiny, but far mightier than I. Please welcome Dolores Huerta.
Ms. Huerta, you've dedicated your long life to farm workers, feminism, and economic injustice. Where did you get your drive and compassion from?
I inherited the activist streak from my father. He was a farm worker, miner, and union activist in New Mexico. But my mother was the real catalyst. She was the kindest woman and gave so much to others. After my parents divorced, she opened up her own hotel through a lot of hard work. We lived in a very diverse agricultural community, very poor people. She lowered her rates for the low-wage workers and offered them to stay there, sometimes for free. When I was a teacher, I often saw students come to school with bare feet, soiled clothes, not having eaten for days. I knew I had to do more. These people are essential, Without them, the country starves, yet they couldn't afford to feed their own families.
How did you come to form the National Farm Workers Association, or the United Farm Workers Union, as it's now called?
I met Cesar Chavez through the Stockton Community Service Organization, and we agreed that we should unite farm workers, but the CSO didn't like that. So we left and we started the United Farm Workers Union in 1962. I secured aid for dependent families, disability insurance for farm workers. We set up healthcare, a co-op, credit union. This was all in the San Joaquin Valley. But we wanted to unite all farm workers. But the very rich, very powerful growers did not. The farm workers were afraid of the growers. They said, Dolores, no se puede. But I said, sí se puede. Yes, we can.
Can you tell us about the events leading up to the Grape Boycott?
We led farm workers in strikes, peaceful strikes. But the police came in and beat us, arrested us. This national outrage led to the march in Sacramento on March 17th, 1966. The march started in Delano with Cesar leading 75 Filipino and Latino workers. And we walked 340 miles to Sacramento. As we walked to the fields, more and more farm workers joined us. We arrived in Sacramento on April 10th, 1966, my 36th birthday. There were 10,000 people there waiting to greet us. The march brought us national attention to the plight of farm workers. But the growers refused to sit down with us. So, what are we going to do? Well, we staged a boycott. We asked our fellow Americans to join us in boycotting the purchase of grapes. This was the late 60s, an incredible time for social justice movements. There was the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and our farm workers movement, and they intersected in many ways. Many of us understood that we were connected and that we would be stronger if we worked together. The strike really took off in New York. The Puerto Rican and Black communities were immediately sympathetic to our cause. And then Gloria Steinem pushed the Grape Boycott to the forefront of the feminist movement, which surprised many, turned off some. I was a woman surrounded by men. There was a lot of machismo. I had to fight to be heard amongst my own movement. There were women working in the fields that were often met with violence. They needed childcare and protections. So my and Gloria's fights overlapped. The combined effort of all these movements saying, don't buy grapes, resulted in the plummeting of grape sales. By 1969, 17 million people had stopped buying grapes. Sales dropped 40%. The growers were forced to come to the table. We negotiated healthcare benefits, wage increases, and established the right of the Farm Workers Union to bargain on behalf of the farm workers. In my opinion, there are two effective ways to make change: organization and hitting your target in the pocketbook.
And you did all of this with 11 children. How did that affect your work?
I was criticized relentlessly. Having that many children and by 3 separate partners was unacceptable to many. There is a very small window of what is acceptable in society, and you'll be criticized relentlessly no matter where you stand outside of that. But we managed. Sometimes it was difficult. I wasn't there a lot. I devoted my life to fighting on behalf of others, and they resented the lifestyle. So when we moved to Delano to organize the farm workers' strikes, we lived a very poor, meager life, and this was by choice. My children went to school and they saw other children talking about the new toys and clothes and television shows, and they didn't have any of that. We sacrificed a lot. And it wasn't just material sacrifices. I was often absent. It must have seemed to them that the movement was more important than them. And sometimes it was. I wouldn't wish any other woman to put their children through what I put mine through, but they have a strong sense of injustice and purpose, They grew up in some ways deprived of money, normalcy, and even me. But they grew up to know how powerful a person can be, how we can use our bodies for change. But we went through some very difficult times.
Are you still involved with the UFW?
No, in 2002, after 40 years, I left the United Farm Workers Union. Well, after Cesar died, it became evident that I was no longer welcome. But that same year, I won the Puffin Nation Prize for Creative Citizenship, which was $100,000. And with it, I started the Dolores Huerta Foundation. This is a culmination of all my passions. It focuses on grassroots and community movements and giving them the tools to organize and create change in their communities.
You've won countless awards, have received many honorary doctorates. Schools bear your name. April 10th is even called Dolores Huerta Day. You've been named one of the most important women of the 20th century, alongside Mother Teresa and Rosa Parks. And in 2012, President Barack Obama presented you with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. What was that like?
Well, I was honored, of course, but I said, you know, you stole my phrase, si se puede. And he said, yes, I did. He's lucky I let him off easy.
Dolores Huerta is 90 years old and continues her work with the Dolores Huerta Foundation, touring and consulting for others who wish to organize and create lasting change.
Sacrifice is a word that is heard often throughout a woman's life. As Ms. Huerta said, there is a small window of what is considered acceptable in society, and having children and a career is ridiculed at worst, difficult at best. After Marty and I graduated from Cornell, I got a job as a claims adjuster, a job that came with decent pay. When I mentioned in passing that I was 3 months pregnant, I was demoted to the lowest rank possible. This was the first of many incidents like this. I interviewed at many law firms and courts, but was denied a position at each one because I had a child, or simply because I was a woman. When I was teaching at Rutgers years later and found out I was pregnant with our second child, my happiness was dampened by the realization that my upcoming contract renewal might be denied. I started wearing large coats and hiding any signs of my pregnant body, and in September, after I successfully signed a new contract, only then did I reveal that I was expecting. I gave birth 8 days later. It is because of my own experience with the pressure to choose between one role or another, that of mother or scholar, nurturer or provider, that I have long been adamant that a woman cannot be equal in this society unless she has the right to control her own body and make choices that she knows are in her own best interest. That includes the right to get pregnant and the right not to.
In 1970, Air Force nurse Captain Susan Struck got pregnant. Despite Struck having saved enough sick leave and vacation time to have the baby, the Air Force said she had to terminate the pregnancy or resign. Abortion was illegal almost entirely throughout the U.S., and yet it wasn't for the military. Because Struck refused to abort, they sent her discharge notices. So she went to the ACLU, where Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a lawyer, and the case went to the Supreme Court.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, Air Force regulation singles out pregnancy, a physical condition unique to women involving a normally brief period of disability, as cause for immediate and voluntary discharge. No other physical condition, whether affecting a man or a woman, is similarly treated. Restrictive rules, and particularly discharge for pregnancy rules, operate as built-in headwinds that drastically curtail women's opportunities. It encourages women officers not to bear children by prohibiting them from remaining in the Air Force if they do. Men in the Air Force, on the other hand, are not encouraged on pain of discharge to avoid the pleasures and responsibilities entailed in fathering children. A man serves in the Air Force with no unwarranted governmental intrusion into his choice whether to beget a child. The woman serves subject to regulation. I filed this brief with the Supreme Court on December 4th, 1974. But the Air Force saw the loss looming and changed its policies before the case could be brought to trial. I filed 4 other pregnancy-related cases, but the Supreme Court continually maintained that pregnancy was voluntarily undertaken and desired, and that if women want to work, they shouldn't get pregnant, despite the fact that it takes 2 to tango, and yet no man is discharged for the same act. I helped pin the pregnancy discrimination case passed by Congress in 1978. The act ensured that pregnant employees were treated the same as any other temporarily disabled worker, and to treat them otherwise is discrimination. Nelly, it's your turn to take the stand.
Do you want to interview me?
Oh, I think the queen of sensationalism is more than capable of telling us a compelling story without my prompting.
What story should I tell? How I went undercover in a madhouse and exposed the asylum's barbaric treatment of patients, about my time spent on the front lines of World War I as a war correspondent. Or maybe my interviews with anarchist Emma Goldman, suffragist Susan B. Anthony, or Belva Lockwood, the first woman admitted to practice law before the Supreme Court and first woman to run for president in 1884.
You're showing off.
That's what I'm known for.
Then I say go big, Miss Bly.
Nelly Bly's Race Around the World. I got the idea on a Sunday. I was a journalist for Joseph Pulitzer's paper, The World, and every Monday I was to present new story ideas for the coming week. But this Monday I had nothing. I wished I could disappear to the other end of the earth. Then I wondered whether Phileas Fogg's journey and Jules Verne's Around the World or 80 Days were truly possible. I said to myself, well, there's your story. Let's find out. The next morning my editor said, have you any ideas? And I said, 1. I want to go around the world. I want to beat Phileas Fogg's record and go around the world in 80 days or less. May I try it? He said they had already toyed with the idea previously and that, of course, they had planned for a man to make the trip. But he took me to the business manager to see what he thought. Unsurprisingly, he shot the idea down at once, saying, "You're a woman. It's impossible for you to do it. We'd have to send you with a protector, and you'd have to carry so much extra baggage, you wouldn't be able to move quick enough. So only a man can do this." I said, "Very well. Start the man, and I'll start the same day for another paper and beat him." He knew I was serious. 1 whole year after that discussion, I was called into my boss's office. He said, "Can you start Around the World day after tomorrow?" I immediately went to the dressmaker and asked him to make me a dress which could withstand constant wear for 3 months. That night, I packed a single hand satchel with 2 traveling caps, 3 veils, a pair of slippers, an outfit of toilet articles, inkstand, pens, pencils, paper, pins, needle and thread, a dressing gown, a blazer, small flask and drinking cup, several changes of underwear, handkerchiefs, and a jar of cold cream. And after a sleepless night of tossing and turning, on November 14th, 1889, at 9:40 and 30 seconds o'clock, I began my tour around the world. The plan was to go around the world in 75 days, 21,700 miles in 75 days. My line of travel was from New York to London, then Calais, where Jules Verne himself met me for an interview. He said, "If you do it in 79 days, I shall applaud with both hands." Knowing full well that I planned to do it in 75 days, he didn't think I could do it. Then Brindisi, Port Said, Ismailia, Suez, Aden, Colombo, Penang, Singapore, Hong Kong, San Francisco, and a train back to New York. I'll never forget that final leg. I was met with throngs of cheering crowds at every station. Throughout my journey, at every port, I sent a wire back to the world reporting on my travels. The hiccups, I was delayed 5 days in Colombo, the near disasters, a monsoon in Hong Kong, and the utterly foreign sights. In Hong Kong, I discovered that I was not alone in my journey. When preparing to transfer, a man in the steamship office said, "You're going to be beaten." I said, "What? I think not. I've made up my delay." He said, "The other woman left here 3 days ago." The other woman? It just so happens that a rival publication, Cosmopolitan, had sent one of their correspondents, a woman named Elizabeth Bisland, around the world in the other direction. Why must the world always pit us women against one another? I told the man in the office, I promised my editor I would go around the world in 75 days, and if I accomplish that, I shall be satisfied. I'm not racing with anyone. But I did not make it in 75 days. On January 25th, 1890, my train rolled into Jersey City Station, and as I stepped onto the platform packed with thousands of people, the cannons at the battery in Fort Greene boomed out the news of my arrival. I took off my cap and waved. My final time was 72 days, 6 hours, 11 minutes, and 14 seconds. Take that, Monsieur Verne. They even published the Nelly Bly board game. Oh, and only because you're sitting there wondering, Bisland completed her trip in 76 days, but I refuse to capitulate to those who pitted us against one another. In the end, we both beat Phileas Fogg's record and had very successful careers as a result.
We have 2 more witnesses to go. I would like to comment.
Ruth! Why don't you come eat something?
Once this is over, Marty, I promise. My husband, Martin Ginsburg.
Sorry to intrude, but she doesn't eat unless I prod. She won't even sleep unless I remind her. Did you know that she stays up till 4 in the morning writing? Stays up all night, gets a few hours of sleep, and then she's right back at it. On the weekends, she zonks out and hibernates to catch up. But then she's back to no sleep. We were going to Harvard together in 1957. I got cancer. I was only 25, but I was too weak and sick to attend class most of the semester. So what did Ruth do? She asked the best note takers of my class to write their notes on carbon paper. And then, at night, she typed them up for me. She typed my papers as I dictated them to her. She fed me around midnight when I finally broke down to eat something. And then at 2 in the morning, she'd start her own schoolwork. She was lucky to get 2 hours of sleep because she had our daughter to care for as well. She's the reason I passed my exams and graduated.
And he's the reason I learned to get by on no sleep.
It's the only thing she can't do. Sleep. Well, and cook. We discovered early on that Ruth was a terrible cook. So I dedicated a large portion of my life to learning how to cook. Our daughter once said, Dad does the cooking, Mom does the thinking. We just played to our strengths, not what society expected of us. I was proud of that.
We met at Cornell and married a few days after I graduated in June 1956. He was the first boy I ever knew who cared that I had a brain. After graduating Harvard, Marty became a tax lawyer, and it was he who brought me my first gender discrimination case, which we worked on together. He later went behind my back and called every lawyer, judge, and politician he knew within a 50-mile radius, imploring them to convince Bill Clinton to put me on the Supreme Court.
Well, someone had to do it. And for all her genius, Ruth never toots her own horn, so I had to play the brass band for both of us. When the vacancy opened up, I called everyone I knew, asking them to put in a good word so she'd at least get an interview. I knew if she could just get the interview, she'd clinch the spot herself. Someone just needed to get her in front of Clinton.
I still don't know how many people you called.
More than you'd be comfortable knowing.
Throughout my life, Marty always made me feel like I was better than I thought myself. I started out by being very unsure, but he pushed me to the top.
I think the most important thing I've ever done is enable Ruth to do what she's done. Now, don't be too long. You have to eat sometime.
Our relationship was called unconventional, but it simply embodied true equality. My life's work was about equality. When I was a young lawyer, I sought to show this with the case Weinberger versus Weissenfeld. Sexism hurts everyone.
Stephen Weissenfeld and his wife Paula also had what was considered an unconventional marriage. Paula taught for 7 years, all the while being the sole spouse paying into Social Security benefits. Then, in June of 1971, while giving birth to their first child, Paula died. Shortly after, Stephen discovered that men could not collect Social Security benefits as a woman could of her husband. Ruth took Stephen's case to the Supreme Court.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, there could not be a clearer case than this one of the double-edged sword and operation of differential treatment accorded similarly situated persons based grossly and solely on gender. Laws of this quality help to keep women not on a pedestal, but in a cage. They reinforce, not remedy, women's inferior position in the labor force. And just as the female insured individual status as breadwinner is denigrated, so the parental status of her surviving spouse is discounted. We won, 8-0. I cried. I was sometimes criticized for representing too many men while working for the ACLU's Women's Rights Project. But I had to show them that gender inequality is a double-edged sword. By winning Social Security benefits for widowers, we fortified the legitimacy of women's work. Sexism is never one-sided.
August 18, 1920. The 19th Amendment was ratified, and women won the right to vote. Every year, its anniversary is celebrated, and the suffragists who fought to secure voting rights are lauded as heroes. While these individuals accomplished an important feat and deservedly earned their place in HERstory, they don't represent the full story. To help tell that story, I'd like to welcome Dr. Mabel Pinghua Lee. Dr. Lee's achievements are extensive. She was head of the first Chinese Baptist church in New York's Chinatown for over 40 years. In 1921, she earned a PhD in economics from Barnard College at Columbia, the first Chinese woman in America to do so. She wrote a monthly column for the magazine Chinese Students in America, and yet, to those who know her, she is best remembered as a suffragist. Dr. Lee, what inspired you to join the movement?
I didn't see anyone in the suffrage movement who looked like me. I came from Canton, China in 1900 or 1901. I was about 5 years old. I knew that sexism negatively impacted both cultures. I wanted to be a voice for Chinese American women and also to take those lessons and spark a movement in China. There was a revolution happening in China, and women had gained the right to vote. But here in America, women were still fighting for that right. And yet, in China, women were still denied liberation in many other ways. Sexist ideologies persisted. Despite its ban, foot binding was still prominent, a practice I was spared, but my mother was not. And it would be 1920 before large universities would begin to admit women. So I wanted both of our societies to progress and to learn from one another, because I knew that no nation could make real and lasting progress in civilization unless its women were abreast to its men.
On May 4th, 1912, at the age of 16, you led 10,000 women on horseback from Washington Square Park to Carnegie Hall. You know, I wrote articles about the women's marches. Our paths may have crossed.
They most likely did. I marched many times. It was important that Asian women were seen. There were many racist policies and stereotypes around Chinese people. So I gathered as many Chinese women as I could. My mother marched. All of our neighbors from Chinatown. We carried banners that said, "Light from China." And another banner read, "National American Women's Suffrage Association catching up with China," pointing out that while many Americans look down on Chinese culture, China was actually ahead of America in women's suffrage. And in November 1912, we held the Night March. Naturally, suffrage marches occurred during the day, so they excluded working women. In the early 1900s, this meant poor women who typically worked as maids, nannies, midwives. Some were teachers. So we organized a night march. This was a march to symbolize hope and to celebrate the progress that we have made. 6 states had upcoming votes on women's suffrage, and we wanted to showcase our fervor to the world. And to be a bit scandalous, of course. Women out after dark? Outrageous. We ordered 5,000 Japanese lanterns from Paris for the march. The plan was to meet at West 58th Street and 5th Avenue and start marching at 8 p.m. 20,000 people were expected. But days before, we learned that rainfall was also expected. We were worried that this would affect the turnout. And as predicted, on the night of the march, the rain poured down in sheets. It was a cold, wet, windy November night. And yet, 15,000 people showed up. And there were 5,000 paper lanterns. And men wore miner's lamps, cars followed with their searchlights and the headlamps, and parade marshals carried batons with electric light bulbs, and we marched down 5th Avenue to Union Square in the pouring rain in one long blaze of glory. My favorite newspaper clipping of that event is a cartoon of a man in his nightshirt and nightcap, leaning out the window, ogling the parade of lights below, and the caption reads, "Goodness, women at this time of night? There must be something in it." Oh, it was a glorious event. But despite our optimism and efforts, women did not get the right to vote that year. Nor the next. You were right, Miss Bly.
I wasn't going to say anything.
In 1913, Nelly Bly predicted that women would not get the vote until 1920. She was on the button.
Well, I got the vote in 1920. Dr. Lee did not.
The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was still in full effect. My father and I were only admitted into the country because he was a minister and a teacher. By 1924, almost all Asian immigration was forbidden. All naturalization was banned. I could not become a citizen.
Dr. Mabel Pinghua Lee died in 1966. The Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't repealed until 1943. No one knows whether she was ever granted citizenship or whether she ever voted. Much of her work was done solely for other women.
Sometimes you turn your light on so that others can see.
Some women had to wait even longer still for the right to vote. To tell their story and her own, I welcome Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer to the stand.
You again. Me and Miss Witness Box have quite the history. Oh, pardon, HERstory.
The floor is yours, Mrs. Hamer.
In 1962, a civil rights group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, we called them SNCC, came to my small town, Ruleville, Mississippi. They spoke on a Monday night at the William Chapel Church. They were there to teach us how to register to vote. Before that, the 15th Amendment of the Constitution gave the blacks the right to vote. But they put in so many loopholes and rules and made it almost impossible for a black to vote. So much so we were scared to do so. Wouldn't even open our doors for SNCC or the Martin Luther King Jr. Ministries. I was scared myself. But a friend asked me to go, and I'm glad I did. The leader of SNCC, James Foreman, told us that we could vote people out of office, hateful people. And you know, that made so much sense. So when they asked who wanted to go down on a Friday to try to register to vote, I held up my hand.
And what made you hold up your hand when so few others did?
Well, I had this saying, and I always said it. We is sick and tired of being sick and tired. My parents, Jim and Luella Townsend, were sharecroppers. The problem is we never made a profit. The sharecropper made sure of that. One year, my friend who could read and do math kept track of the numbers. She saw that she had made in profit $4,000, and the landowner said she only made $200. We barely had enough money to eat. I was sicker and sicker of the system. The last straw was in 1961. I had this little knot, and I went to the doctor to have it removed, a tumor. After the surgery, I found out they had given me a hysterectomy without my permission. They always did that to black women. 60% of black women in Sunflower County, Mississippi, where I was from, went into the hospital for one thing and came out robbed of having children. Why? I asked, why? They didn't give me no reason why, but I know why. My husband and I wanted to have children, but I was robbed of that. Couldn't get a lawyer. A black woman taking on a white doctor, they can do anything they want and get away with it, but we had no power. So when they asked who wanted to go down and become a registered voter, my hand was already twitching.
What happened when you went to register?
Well, me and 17 others got on a bus to Indianola. When we got there, we were told only 2 could go in. So me and Ernest Davis went in to take the literacy test. But before you could, you had to write down by whom you were employed. So by the time you got back home, you were fired from your job. The registrar came out with this big book that had a section of the state constitution that we had to interpret. The darker your skin, the harder the test. Whites passed, blacks did not. He read a portion of the Constitution on the de facto laws. We know as much about a de facto law as a horse knows about Christmas Day. I flunked, but I studied with the help of SNCC, and after 4 months, I went back to take that test, and I passed. After that, I was determined that I was going to help others register to vote. I knocked on doors. I held hand on the bus to Indianola. I even taught people how to read the Constitution. But the problem was, most people were too scared because they thought if they registered to vote, they would lose their job if they did. I did. Day one, after I registered to vote, the landowner came and told me I had to leave that very night if I didn't take my name off the voter's registration book. I told him, I didn't go to register to vote for you. Mayor came out and said, anybody caught taking any voter registration classes will be given a one-way ticket out of town. And if that didn't do it, they did whatever they had available, and they did. My house was firebombed. They shot at me so many times, more than I can count. And then they sent us a $9,000 water bill, and we had no running water. And after this was the arrest.
And it was one of those harrowing arrests that affected you physically for the rest of your life and impacted the nation profoundly. Can you tell us about the 1964 Democratic Convention, Mrs. Hamer?
In 1962, I co-founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, MFDP, a new Democratic Party, one to properly represent the people. In my county alone, after 2.5 years of work to get blacks to register to vote, 155 out of 13,524 blacks had registered to vote, compared to 7,000 white registered voters. Me, Bob Mosley, and Ella Baker started our own party. And we went to the Democratic Convention to unseat and challenge the all-white delegates of the regular Democratic Party. There was 435,000 blacks in Mississippi, and not one black delegate. Now, how is that representation? We traveled 1,200 miles to Atlantic City. I sang all the way there. And we made quite the fuss, legally so, that the Credentials Committee decided to give us a hearing. When we arrived, they put us in this little closed room with no cameras. We were like, The lawyer shamed the reporters, and they were allowed to come into our room. So the Credentials Committee offered to give us a hearing. August 22nd, 1964, 2:55 p.m., the hearing started. The first witness was Aaron Henry and Ed King. They spoke about the danger we faced trying to get blacks to register to vote, how the places we convened in were burned to the ground, and the fact that we lacked representation wasn't due to lack of desire, but self-preservation. By now, it was my turn. I told them how 18 of us got on the bus and drove 26 miles to Indianola, and only 2 of us was allowed to go in. And on our way back, the bus was stopped, and the bus driver got a ticket because the bus was the wrong color. I told him that the landowner told me I had to leave that very night if I didn't take my name off the voters' registration books. And how they shot 16 shots into my friend's house where I was staying. After a voter registration workshop, we stopped at this diner. We got off the bus to use the washroom and were kicked out. I jumped off the bus to see what was going on. We were all arrested. The details are gruesome, terribly horrific. But I had to live it all that day because the world needed to know how bad things were. I had a limp for the rest of my life. Lost sight in one eye. Had kidney damage that affected my health to my dying day. All this because we wanted to become first-class citizens. If the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free, the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hook because our lives be threatened daily because we want to live as decent human beings in America? People were crying in the aisle, and so was I. It was hard to relive. But the country needed to know how bad it was. President Johnson knew that my words had power and that they could change people's minds, and he didn't want that. He even tried to stop us from getting to the convention in the first place. When I began my testimony, he called an emergency press conference, knowing that the news station would break away. But now, mind you, they didn't break away when Martin Luther King Jr. was giving his testimony. No, just mine. It was me that he feared. So they break away thinking that President Johnson was going to announce his pick for vice president. Instead, he announces that it was the 9th month anniversary of Kennedy's assassination. 9th month. Odd number, ain't it? And then he cut away. Yes, it backfired. Because he cut away, when people came home from work in the evening, the news station played my testimony over and over. And the whole country saw it, and the whole country was stunned.
Through all the setbacks and the violence, many would give up. Where did you find your strength?
My mama and God. Christ was a revolutionary person out there where it was happening. That's what God is all about. And that's where I get my strength. Christianity is not building a fancy church with people starving around the corner. It's about your fellow man. It's about the love, not hate. I don't hate. I can get angry. Yes, I can. My mama told me, hate or hating make you just as weak as those who hate you. And as a matter of fact, those who hate you are more scared than I was. As a matter of fact, they were scared to death.
Of what?
Change. Equality.
But isn't equality what we love most about our country?
On paper. But when it comes right down to it, they don't want change because that means that you would have to give up some of your power. And that's a hard thing to do.
Even after losing her fight for delegation seats, Mrs. Hamer inspired many with her testimony. The nation's outrage grew, and she became one essential spoke in the grand wheel, along with the marches of Selma to Montgomery, Dr. King, and John Lewis with the Freedom Riders, spinning towards one of history's major turning points.
August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. And that is when all women and men technically got the right to vote. 55 years ago.
Despite African American men being granted the right to vote by the 15th Amendment of 1870, many states imposed strict voting laws that disenfranchised all but a few Black citizens, effectively rendering the 15th Amendment useless. So when the 19th Amendment passed, granting women the right to vote, it failed to represent all women. Voting rights for Mabel Pinghua Lee and Miss Fannie Lou Hamer arrived by a much longer, muddier road. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was one of the most sweeping civil rights bills ever passed. It did away with biased literacy tests and ridiculous rules, such as making potential Black voters recite the entire Constitution, something I'd like to see our current leaders try. They were no longer asked to interpret complex laws as if they were Harvard law students. The new law allowed federal investigation into states where less than 50% of a non-white population had not registered to vote, thus mitigating a culture of intimidation. That's not to say voter suppression didn't continue. It did. But citizens could now challenge illegal voting practices in court. In 1964, 6% of Black Mississippians were registered to vote. 5 years later, with the help of Mrs. Hamer, 59% were. But in 2013, the Supreme Court case Shelby County versus Holder resulted in the repeal of one of the Voting Rights Act's most crucial sections. Sections 4 and 5 mandated that certain states get approval or preclearance from the federal government before changing its election laws. In a 5-4 decision, it was decided that the law was no longer needed because our country has changed. Racism was over, so the law was obsolete. I dissent. Voting discrimination still exists, but the court today terminates the remedy that proved best suited to block that discrimination. The Voting Rights Act became one of the most consequential, efficacious, and amply justified exercises of legislative power in the nation's history. Throwing out preclearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. As soon as the repeal went into effect, many of the restrictive voting laws that had disappeared when the VRA was ratified reappeared, such as ID laws, last-minute closures of polling stations, or the purging of voter rolls. The fight against disenfranchisement is far from over. The opening words of America's Constitution are perhaps my favorite. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. The original We the People excluded many. If you were African American, Indigenous, Hispanic, Asian, gay, transgender, a woman, you were not included in We the People. My mission in life was to expand who was included, so we could in fact work towards a more perfect union. We are not perfect, nor are we in union when equality falters. One of the first cases I won as a young lawyer was V Reid in 1971. Idaho state law said that the administrator of an estate had to be male. When the case went to the Supreme Court, I argued that biological differences between the sexes bear no relationship to the duties performed by an administrator. We won the case. This was the first time that the 14th Amendment, which requires equal protection under the law, was applied towards sex. V Reid set the precedent that no policy could discriminate against a woman on the basis of sex. If you are a woman who owns a house or has a credit card in your name, it was this case that opened that door. Prior to 1971, companies or state governments could deny women basic rights and luxuries simply because they thought women weren't capable of handling such responsibilities. I wrote this brief standing on the shoulders of women who came before me, like Polly Murray, the lawyer whose work laid the foundation for V Reid. And because of her work, I was able to create opportunities for women in the future. I can only hope that others stand on my shoulders in turn, and we one day see that more perfect union.
We have a long way to go. You know what the problem is? We are all so isolated. But each one of us have a unique light, and we have to let that light shine. but not snuff out the light of the women standing next to us, but shine those lights so they beams over everyone. Fan the flames so the fire blazes high. You raise one up, we all go up. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. All over my sisters, I'm gonna let it shine. All over my sisters, I'm gonna let it shine. All over my sisters, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
Ruth, why don't you come get some rest now? You're gonna have to trust them to take it from here.
Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
My name is Patty Terrell. I'm the founder and president of the Women's Journey Foundation. We hope that you enjoyed our program of Making Her Story. Making Her Story has become a big part of what we do here at the Women's Journey Foundation to educate, empower, and engage women and girls of all ages. The Women's Journey Foundation is a volunteer-operated organization, and we are always looking for volunteers to lend their talents and skills. But this foundation is also very grateful for donations because our donations keep our programs viable. And last year, in 2020, we took our Girls Self-Esteem program to a national audience for the first time. So we do programs like this because we want to change lives. And we know that when we share the stories of women in American history, this gives girls an opportunity to understand that they could achieve almost anything. And it builds self-esteem. If you'd like to get involved with us, become a member of our team, go to our website at womensjourneyfoundation.org. You can also make donations there as well. And then we also have this amazing original painting that you saw in the performance. It's called Lady Justice. It was created by a Walt Disney artist by the name of Leslie Turnbull. It's up for auction, and it's ready now for you to take. And your contributions will help us grow our programs. So you can bid, you can donate, and you can volunteer, again, at womensjourneyfoundation.org. Thank you for being part of Making Her Story. Good night.